Hi, thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. What we're going to do here is cover the Workspot design concepts. So this playbook is intended for MSPs, partners, and customers that want to deploy Workspot, anywhere from a simple lab environment to a full-blown enterprise solution. So what we'll do here is walk through the fundamental design concept and show you how it'll scale out. So we'll start with our basic design concept, and we'll refer to these as single box designs. And in this single box design, the box is represented with this blue box in the middle. So you can think of that as a dedicated Azure subscription, a dedicated Google project, or a dedicated AWS member account. And so this is dedicated to a Workspot deployment. And on the left-hand side, we see the Workspot control plane, which makes that microservice connection into that dedicated box. And from there, that's the API channel that's used to provision the resources from a template. So the IT admin would log into the Workspot control plane, which is separated from the data plane, a very important security consideration. And from there, what they'll do is they'll do their, configure their pools, and the provisioning commands will go down to the cloud provider, and then they'll start to appear. Now, in the bottom here, we have the end user. The end user has a Workspot client, and we also have a web client. They can click on that, connect to a secure gateway that's also located in that box. And additionally, as we scale to different regions, we put those gateways in the different regions as appropriate. And when they make that connection, they get access to the resources that they were entitled to, and that session comes straight back down to the end user. A high-level summary of this single box design is a customer just needs a simple self-contained EUC solution. It's a great starting point for a customer or an MSP that needs a battle-tested EUC delivery platform that just works. Workspot's been using this for the last 6 or 7 years, and we have many customers using this today. The foundational design concept is hyper-scalable, multiple regions within that single box. We can even add in multiple different clouds, so Workspot Control can connect to each of those clouds, and we'll get into those more advanced design concepts a little later on. This is great when each customer would have their own dedicated Workspot control, and they connect to their own dedicated IaaS or MSP hosted IaaS. So however, if an MSP is going to use this, they could give a customer each their own control tenant and then connect it to whatever IaaS they need to connect it to. And again, if networking is needed to other resources, which is quite common, we'll refer to those two box designs. So the how-to is start at community.workspot.com. That's where you'll find our getting started material for the different clouds that you're interested in delivering this solution on. And for uses, this standard design concept is good for MSPs, partners, like I said earlier, and self-service customers, also demo environments, training labs. And MSPs could also consider this design concept if they want to host multiple smaller customers in a single control and a single box. So there's possibilities to do things along those lines as well. So currently GCP, AWS EC2, AWS Core, and Azure are the cloud providers that we support. We also support on-premises if you're running vSphere or Nutanix. That's a bit out of the scope of this design, but it would fundamentally be the same, and you could actually scale into that as well. Next one we're going to look at, still a very basic design, still that core fundamental single box concept, only what we're doing here is we're leveraging cloud native identity services. So in this case, Entra ID, which was known as Azure Active Directory. So Workspot supports Azure Active Directory only type of deployments, meaning that there's no enterprise connector needed in this particular design because we're not talking to a legacy Active Directory anymore. We're using Azure Active Directory groups. And so the computer objects themselves are actually joining the Entra ID for the directory services. And also the users will be using the identity from Entra ID. So what happens here in this design, it's still a very simple design. Workspot Control has a connection to the Azure tenants, just a simple enterprise application that can sense principal least privilege access to look up user accounts and validate that that's the user. But when a user clicks on the Workspot icon, they get redirected to that login box from Microsoft. So they're not entering in credentials into a Workspot login. They're actually getting redirected to their own Microsoft login. And once that user identity is authenticated or validated, an OIDC token gets sent back to the client, and the token goes back up to the gateway in that particular region. And then from there, once they're validated in, they can log into their Azure Active Directory join resource. And so that's this concept here. And, again, it's not very different from the basic foundation. We're just pointing to a different identity provider and using a different directory service. So we have clients and customers looking at this type of option now, because as we get more cloud native and that matures out there, this provides the ability to leverage those cloud native services. And again, this is hyperscalable to multiple regions. This also works across multiple clouds. And, like I stated earlier, what's nice about this is we use OIDC tokens instead of username and passwords for get through that main public entry point. And the gateways don't need to be domain joined. So from a security perspective, that makes it even nicer. And these gateways should be isolated in their own separate subnet within that box too, just to further isolation. And again, if the networking is required, we'll refer to those two box designs in a little bit. But the how-to, same place, just go to community.workspot.com. Now, uses for this are the same as the fundamental design. We're just using a different identity, and we're kind of simplifying things. We took out the Active Directory, the legacy Active Directory component. The enterprise connector is no longer needed, so it scales it back a little bit, even from an infrastructure standpoint. One thing to note here, though, it's supported on GCP, Azure, AWS EC2, and Azure. Currently, AWS Core doesn't support this, so we'd have to use like a hybrid mode for that. And the same thing with vSphere and Nutanix. We would simply just use a hybrid type of mode. We'll cover that in a little bit later. One other thing to note, though, with respect to cloud apps, Microsoft only supports this on their cloud. So if we need cloud apps, and if we're on GCP and or EC2, what we would do there is have to use that hybrid mode where we bring in the legacy Active Directory back into the picture. So this is that hybrid design concept that I was just talking about. So as you can see here, the only difference here is now we have to reintroduce the enterprise connector, and we bring in the Active Directory services. We could host this in a different box, but again, if the AD DNS is in another location, we can just peer out to where that needs to go, and we'll cover that a little bit later. But everything else remains the same. Nothing changes. So again, the summary here for this type of concept is we need both Entra ID for IDP, but we still need some Active Directory for the cloud desktop and cloud app directory services. And the rest is all the same, community.workspot.com. And if we look at this, it could be a standard design for MSPs and partners. I would say it'd be more common for partners taking care of customers and customers themselves. MSPs might not want to do this one, but they certainly can. Certainly within the scope of what can be done. So now, if you look down here at the supported public clouds and private clouds, that puts everything back into scope as far as being able to scale this out to these different environments. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit, building on that AD hybrid design concept. But what we're going to do here is switch out the IDP, and Workspot natively supports Okta. So again, same type of concept where the user is redirected to, this time instead of Entra ID, they're redirected to Okta. Then the same concept with the OIDC token coming back through the gateway applies. And then the compute objects are all Active Directory joined. Nothing else changes. Still the fundamental design applies. We're just pointing to a different IDP. So this is becoming quite common for us as we're starting to see a lot of Okta out there, and then there's an Okta requirement, and this is how we handle that particular requirement. And the how-tos, all the same place, community.workspot.com. And the uses here, again, can apply to the same type of folks. MSPs could certainly use this if they have Okta. And this is also supported on all our platforms. So that way, as long as we have that legacy Active Directory component in the mix, and we do need that right now for Okta and at this time. So once you have this, it does put all the platforms into play. Now, let's take this even a step further. There's a lot of IDPs out there. So Workspot has an IDP service that we could leverage to use other third-party IDPs out there. If it's not Entra ID or Okta, we can support the other IDPs, and our Workspot IDP service will federate with that other third-party IDP, and the same concept that we just spoke about will apply. They'll get redirected to that customer's third party, get the token back, and go through the gateway. Everything else is exactly the same as we've just been talking about. It just extends the capability of what we can offer for a front door IDP service. And so, again, the summary here is we meet the non-Microsoft and non-Okta cloud native identity requirements. And even if they still need Okta, we could still use the Workspot IDP service, but we don't need that. We support Okta natively. So the other uses, primarily partners, self-service customers would be potentially, but less likely, MSPs, demo environments, and labs in this kind of a concept. But we do support that across all the platforms. This design's pretty interesting. We've got some customers that require a little bit more sophistication. And what was cool about this, fundamentally, Workspot really doesn't change. And in this concept, we actually have both Okta and Entra ID. Now, what's interesting here is the customers would have their federation with Okta with their Azure tenant. But what we can do is make Okta the single source of truth and the main IDP. So when a user clicks on the Workspot icon, they get redirected to Okta. Now, the interesting thing here is we can still do Azure Active Directory owned computer objects in this type of scenario. So once they get the token and go through, they can log on to an Azure AD joined cloud desktop. And what's interesting here is now, because we're doing this, when a user clicks on the Workspot, they're working in their cloud desktop and they have to go to Microsoft Office, for example. They'll click on Microsoft Office to get to that URL, and there'll be a NAT gateway and Okta access policies that only allow access to Microsoft resources if they're using this cloud desktop. So this is kind of a way to layer in different security requirements. So we do have some customers that like this, and they use this today. So this, again, a standard design for partners and self-service customers if these requirements are in play. I would say potentially less likely for MSPs and demo environments and labs, but certainly could be done. And in the clouds right now, this particular design, we could really only support on GCP, AWS EC2, and Azure. They're not Workspot limitations. We can't support it on Core yet. And vSphere and Nutanix obviously are on premises. So, and again, cloud apps in an Entra ID scenario are only supported on Azure. Now this single box design is a little bit more advanced. We have some enterprise customers looking at to do this. Now what we're looking at here is we're actually doing a box in box type of concept where we still have the single main box, but a customer might have multiple Azure subscriptions or multiple GCP projects or multiple AWS accounts. That Workspot control plane can make a connection to each one of those individually. And the cool thing here is they don't even really necessarily need to talk to each other because we'll use Entra ID and do Azure Active Directory join. And so you can completely isolate all these. And then from a gateway perspective, a couple different things can happen here. We could have a dedicated box for the gateways, and we can peer the different other boxes to those gateways to share them, or we could actually put these gateways within each box. Now, when I use the term box here too, we can actually take this up a level. You could picture this blue box being maybe an enterprise customer's estate of Azure tenants, and inside, instead of being like, for example, an Azure subscription, this white box here could be actually a whole Azure tenant dedicated to Workspot. You might want to do this for very large deployments, and you want to break it up into business units. You want to reduce your blast radius for failures. All these kind of concepts can come into play. But what's really interesting here is you could use a single identity on the main, so I've got an Azure tenant here, which contains all the identities and the compute objects for the directory services, but we're actually delivering these actual cloud desktops onto different IaaS. So it's a really interesting concept some of our enterprises are going to be using today. I just wanted to point this one out. We're getting a little bit more advanced, but again, it's still simplicity in the whole foundation of it all. And so, this has come about like where there's more isolation needed, whether it's dividing up by business units, or simply they want to kind of reduce potential outage, blast radius on outages and things along those lines. So this is kind of one of these type of designs that we could leverage for that. Now, currently we can support this on GCP, AWS EC2, and Azure. And because it's Entra ID only, Core doesn't support it. vSphere and Nutanix are not really supported for this either. Now, obviously, we could get into a hybrid mode here, but then you've got Active Directory considerations and maybe having to link up some of these boxes via networking. That's something a customer or an MSP or partner is going to have to decide how to architect that, but it's certainly doable. So that concludes the one single box design concepts. Now what we're going to do is get into the idea that, hey, that single box is great, but I need to connect to other resources. So we're going to go into what we call a two box design. And at its core, it's still using the fundamental Workspot design, where we have a dedicated a box for the Workspot deployment. But if you notice here, what could different is that we could peer or use a VPN over to other customer cloud assets. And typically what we do strongly recommend is when you peer over to something, whatever we peer to needs to have the ability to, firewall, obviously, because you want to build in extra security, but also be able to simply route the packets to where they need to go. It's fundamental. If I'm on a cloud desktop, it's very different from your typical third-party service that might peer in or poke into a network. They don't really need to worry about routing. But if you think about what we're doing here, this service, Workspot, is providing cloud desktops. These cloud desktops need to access potentially many different resources across different locations across a customer's organization. So this is where the routing is super critical, very common. I mean, but I just need to make sure that we point that out. It's a fundamental thing. Now, if you notice, why we call it a two box design is because we have the Workspot box and we got the box that we connect to. Now, where that box we connect to goes from there, there's all kinds of possibilities, but that's outside of the scope of Workspot. And, as you can see, those boxes are typically have an on-premises connection already. And so that's where we come into play there. And again, this is where a customer requires connectivity to other resources. Now, this is another variation of this, is where we have the peer over to the cloud, but also there's a requirement because we need to be in some sort of hybrid scenario where we still have to provision desktops from Workspot from on-premises. So we could support connection to a vCenter or Nutanix Prism, where Workspot control, it talks to those components, and from there we can actually provision desktops onto the customer's hardware. So if you think of situations where we need to be able to work in a hybrid mode, hey, we're on-prem, we can't get these users off-prem, you can consider keeping your old legacy solution there for a while, or you could actually start leveraging Workspot to start to provision those workloads. And then while the cloud-based Workspot workloads, we just continue to do those as normal. So there's a couple different variations on how you want to approach this, but that's the fundamental design. So like I said, we do support on-premises, vSphere, Nutanix at the moment, because that's the most common hypervisors out there that we see. We in the past have supported other hypervisors, but we really don't see them out there, so we don't really maintain the support for those. I figured most of the world's on vSphere and Nutanix at this point. So same concept here with the two box model, where we have Entra ID And in a hybrid design concept, it's not uncommon for the Active Directory services to be located outside of the Workspot box. So there's, however a customer wants to design this just represents a connection to other resources that they may need to access. So this would be the very common two-box design. And really all we're doing here is just introducing a mechanism to put a network tentacle out to where it needs to go. And so that these resources here that the users use can consume the resources that they need access to do their job. So, again, this is basically that hybrid design. And this is supported on all our clouds that we support. So as long as we have that native ability to do that, we can, using legacy AD, we can support the different platforms. We could have situations where a lot of these gateways don't have to be joined to the domain because OIDC tokens are used. And so again, it brings some interesting possibilities here. So again, two-box design using Okta. We covered because we do have to have connectivity over to a customer cloud, but you see, it doesn't fundamentally change from our foundational single box design. It's just that we need network connectivity, so we peer over to the other box. We already covered conceptually what this looks like in a single box design. We're just adding the networking piece to this. And this is where it gets a little more complex, right? But out there in the world we see some complexity. But here, this example is using our IDP service, customer IDP service. It could be Azure, Azure Entra ID tenant, all kinds of possibilities here. But this is a concept where, this is kind of bolting all these pieces together, but still in the middle we have our foundational box. Now, let's get into some multi-cloud design concepts where we're using basically single box designs for this. So if I look at a foundational multi-cloud, again, we get the Workspot control plane. Because it's isolated from the data plane, this provides tremendous flexibility. So if we look at, we've got GCP, AWS, Azure, so each has a single box. So the foundation single box is still in play, and Workspot makes the connections to the IaaS. And so from the end user, we can access any one of these clouds from the Workspot client. We can provision the resources. Additionally, what's typical is you put a VPN between the clouds so that the domain services, the ADDNS services can talk across the three clouds. And that way you could fail over from one cloud to the next seamlessly using our global desktop feature. But even this, even our sales demo environment, for example, uses this concept. We're multi-cloud and we just have a single Active Directory, and we just spread it out across the clouds. Very powerful design. But you can see it's fundamentally just a single box design, just putting Lego blocks together, if you will. This is a pretty simple self-contained multi-cloud EUC solution, and you could use this in labs, and you could use this for customers that need to have that multi-cloud capability. And a lot of enterprises were certainly seeing that. So we'll take that same multi-cloud design concept, and now, as you can see here, we're going to introduce Azure Active Directory. So Entra ID only. So very, very possible to do that same design. And what's nice here is VPN is optional, because you can kind of keep these clouds isolated from each other, or like our networking foundational connection to VPN or peer over to what other resources they need to do, but we're still putting these Workspot resources in their own boxes. And so this will meet a Entra ID only cloud native identity directory services management. Again, AWS Core has a bit of a limitation there. Cloud apps are only supported on Azure. So that's when we would start to look at a hybrid, and that's where you bring in the back end the domain controllers and DNS services and whatever construct you want to use, but typically VPN between them. You could have a transit. There's all kinds of possibilities here, but out of the scope of what we're talking about, because in the context of Workspot, it's just plugging these boxes in where they need to go into the fabric of what an enterprise has already. So this is where we want to try to meet all the various requirements, and this is where we need to reintroduce Active Directory into the mix. We can do this same concept in a hybrid mode using Okta. So we're just using the same basic concepts we started with earlier in this video, and we're just extending it out. So again, this is basically just for the Okta Cloud Native Identity requirement. And we also support this with our Workspot IDP service. So we have customers that may have different IDPs. So now we want to take a look at foundational AWS design concepts. We're going to look at this from the perspective of a two-box design, and this could easily be a single-box design as well, but I wanted to show you the networking component. And the reason I wanted to focus in on AWS over the other clouds, because there's a slight difference here that folks need to understand, because we do support core and EC2. So there's folks out there wondering, well, how exactly does that look? So let me present that to you. So if we look at Workspot on AWS Workspaces core from a networking design concept, what we have here essentially in this design is AWS core has dedicated subnets, and we could actually have dedicated subnets for EC2, thus separating the two environments, but within the same account. And so we have the workspaces that folks are familiar with in their particular regions and their template bundles, as they call them. And Workspot control can connect specifically to the Workspot core layer. And what happens here, which is a little different from everything else, is we actually pass off the provisioning capabilities to AWS core, which is a little different from what we normally do, because we usually interact directly with the cloud provider APIs and do the provisioning ourselves. But in this integration, AWS core is doing the provisioning. So Workspot control can actually use this bundle that gets created and provision those desktops from Workspot control. So you get the added benefit of a management layer on top of workspaces that provides a little wider range of support. So in other words, if I had non-persistent use cases that core doesn't support, we could put those on EC2. Additionally, because of the control plane that Workspot has, we can connect in, as you've seen earlier, into other clouds. So we can greatly extend the capabilities of an Amazon Workspaces core deployment. And of course, the network connectivity is the same concept, where we have either VPC peers, VPNs, and in the AWS world, we have transit gateways that can connect over to other resources, an Active Directory service, and Microsoft Active Directory is actually a requirement of core, so we need that anyways. Now, of course, if we wanted to go a single box design, we could simply put an AD domain controller down here. But in any event, it's quite common that folks need to access other resources. So that's why I want to illustrate this with the networking piece included. But as you can see, it's the same foundational concept. It's just there's a subtle nuanced difference when it comes to our AWS support. So if I take this to the next level, so this is AWS core, and there's potential to have to expand that concept into EC2 or other clouds. So if we look at that, what changes here is now, as you can see, we've introduced EC2 cloud desktops and regions into the mix here, again, within that single account. And the gateways are shared between core and EC2, which is nice. So I don't have to, the core desktops and the EC2 desktops all come through the same gateways. But what's different here is we also, Workspot control actually has a connection into the EC2 layer as well. So that way, simultaneously, we can support both. And again, the same networking stuff applies, and you're using the Workspot client to do the connectivity to that. Now, if we take this out a little step further, this is where we have to combine different use cases like cloud apps on EC2 or non-persistent desktops on EC2 or maybe some persistent bundles that aren't available on core. So that's basically the overview of what that looks like. Now, if we want to introduce an identity provider in this example, because we still need we still need AD for the core layer. So we can't do pure Enter ID only. So what we need to do is introduce that Enter ID hybrid type of concept. So in this example here, what you'll see gets added into the mix is there's an AD connector, and we actually in this design put the domain controller right inside the EC2 part, and Workspot Enterprise Connector comes back in the mix because that's required for AD group lookups. And then, of course, we've got the Azure AD Connect element to this, syncing with the customer's tenant. So going back to our earlier designs from the Workspot client perspective, they get redirected to Azure. Whatever MFA, whatever conditional access, all that kind of good stuff comes in play out of the scope of what we're doing here. And then they come get the token, come back to the gateway and access either EC2 or core resources. So that's really the concept right there. So I just wanted to illustrate that. Maybe at some point, core will support Enter ID only, but in the meantime, this is the design we've got for a couple customers today. Again, a little summary on that, on what that looks like and why we would do that. And one last thing I want to touch on before we call it a day here is let's take a quick peek at on-premises and just a one-box design. Again, this can scale out to 2-box designs, and I've illustrated that a little earlier, but I just wanted to kind of dial in on premises. So conceptually, it would be the same in the terms of user would connect in through a gateway. Workspot control plane is talking directly to a vCenter or a Nutanix Prism, and from there, once we have that communication, very simple configuration that just points to the vCenter with its IP address and user that's got the rights to provision desktops. So we could use leverage the template that's in this hardware infrastructure, the AD DNS services, and of course one other element to this would be adding the enterprise connector for the Workspot part and Workspot gateways. If in an on-prem situation, if it's VPN is the more desired path, we can certainly support that too. But the gateways make it super simple. You would just simply isolate those gateways in its own dedicated subnet. So that's kind of what on-premises looks like. So I just wanted to give you a peek into that. So with that concludes this presentation of the Workspot Design Concept Playbook. Thanks.